1 week season.
What is going on, OWS fam? Welcome to the week 6 edition of the OWS Angles podcast. I am your host, I am your guest, I am JMToWin. As always, throw this baby on 1.5x speed or 2x speed. And let's get started with a week that is sort of similar to last week, but also has a lot of unique components that we didn't see last week. A little bit different too, in that, so why do I say this week is similar? So last week, really great week, the way that it's set up for the OWS community, in that there were two game environments in particular that had a decent shot, I guess 3 game environments in particular that had a decent shot at shooting out in such a way that they completely separated from whatever else was available on the slate. But also those game environments had some mix and match components where it was a little bit expensive to play pieces from those games. B, it was kind of difficult to predict who would benefit if those games were shooting out. And so what we ended up seeing was people leaning into the certainty as opposed to attacking that uncertainty. So what we talked about last week, and we took Baltimore and Cincinnati as our main example, and we talked about if Baltimore and Cincinnati shoots out, players from this game are probably going to be featured on tournament winning rosters. And so if you don't have players from this game, or if you don't have the right pieces from this game, you're probably going to be chasing the rosters that do. So we don't want to think about just what can we guess right on or get right on our own rosters, but what will a tournament winning roster look like on a given week? So last week, it was very clear to see that there was potential for Baltimore Cincinnati to play out in such a way that you would need pieces from that game in order to compete for tournament wins. But again, because it was like, well, who do you stack Lamar with? And can you pay all the way up for Jamar Chase and all those components? Well, you ended up seeing most rosters not focusing on that game. And so by mixing and matching pieces from that game, or even if you're a single entry 3-max player, by just saying, all right, I might guess wrong, but I'm going to guess on pieces from this game, you positioned yourself for those tournament wins. And so last week, set up in this way that really benefits OWS, and then it played out in such a way that we were able to benefit with, for me, 60% of my quarterback exposure was Lamar, Burrow, and Joe Flacco. I had like 35% Jamar Chase. I had about 20% T. Higgins, and most of the field was not attacking those pieces at the same level. And then obviously Flacco taking off in that Colts and Jags game with Brian Thomas Jr. as my main bring back. Unfortunately, it was all Pittman and Downs with Flacco for me. So no Alec Pierce on those rosters on his 3 targets and his 35-point DraftKings scored. So, but when we find spots like weekends like that, where there are games that can separate from everything else, and the field is leaning more towards certainty as opposed to trying to mix and match the spots, that really benefits us. So this week is kind of similar in that there are some games that could take off. Now they're less likely to take off than some of the games that we saw last week, but the ceiling is the same, or at least the individual offenses have some ceiling. There's some complexities that we didn't have in place on last week's slate in terms of how things could play out and how things could develop and how we want to attack as a result of that. But again, similar setup in that there's a couple games that could completely separate, and that the field is not going to attack those games as heavily as they should. And so if those games underwhelm, then there's going to be totally different paths to a first place finish on this particular week. But if those games end up hitting, it's unlikely that you'll be able to get tournament wins focusing on other spots. So those are things that we want to account for in our builds this week. I guess before I go any further, realized a couple weeks ago that we have quite a few viewers tuning in for this show, which means not all of you are OWS subscribers, and maybe not all of you are even familiar with this show, familiar with my content. So really quickly, what the Angles podcast is we're going to take a big picture view at the slate, how the slate shapes up, and how we want to be attacking it for our DFS rosters. Now, everything we talk about on OWS is through the lens of an understanding that DFS is not a game of picking players. DFS is a game of roster construction. DFS is a game of strategy and game theory. DFS is a game of understanding probabilities and positioning ourselves to take advantage of those probabilities with plus EV decisions. Plus EV meaning plus expected value, or the way that I always say it is, if we could play out this slate 100 times, would this decision make you money? And that's the lens through which we want to be thinking with DFS. So obviously that's a different approach than a lot of content creates, because what most content consumers want is picks. What most content consumers want is, oh, this guy's a smash play this week, or fade this guy this week, and that type of thinking. And so obviously, if you're a business trying to make money, you cater to that type of thinking, because that's what gets subscribers in the door, and sometimes even what keeps subscribers around. Obviously, we take a different approach on OWS. So yes, you might pick up some things in here that you haven't thought of before. You might hear things that are coming from different angles. And not to say that we're the only site or content providers that do that. There's some really sharp people on other sites who talk through these angles. That's our core focus here. And so that's the lens through which this podcast explores the slate. And if you're listening to this, hopefully you'll pick up some things that will help you on this particular week in terms of how the slate shapes up and some of the strategies that we want to be thinking about in order to maximize our chances of not just profiting on this week, but getting to those first place finishes, because that's where the money is in tournaments. We want to always be thinking about what will a first place roster potentially look like this week, and how do I build my rosters such that they are those first place rosters that other people are trying to chase. Okay, so we're going to start with one of the key decision points on this slate. And then at the end of this exploration of the slate, we're going to touch on two more of the key decision points on this slate. So the first decision point I want to touch on is Spencer Rattler starting at quarterback for the Saints. So as we get into Saturday and more injury news develops, we might find that Spencer Rattler, the attention on Spencer Rattler is diminishing, right? More value opens up, and it becomes less exciting to pay $4K for a quarterback. But as of right now, Friday morning, initial ownership projections, which are largely based off of projections, raw projections, and what optimizers are going to be spitting out and what people are thinking about for cash gains, because again, optimizers' projections are also going to be thinking about what is the sharpest way to build from a median projection standpoint for beating 50% of the field. Right now, Spencer Rattler is coming in anywhere from 16 to 20% projected ownership. So again, that could change throughout the weekend as more value opens up. Last week when we recorded this podcast, Trey Tucker was projected for like 12 to 15% ownership. And then as value continued to open up, people were like, why do I want to play Trey Tucker in this tough matchup against Denver? And that ownership went down to, 5-7%, somewhere in that range. So we could see something similar happen here. But right now, Spencer Rattler is shaping up as one of the key decision points on the slate. If Spencer Rattler, a 4K quarterback, is owned at a 20% clip, and he ends up being the way to go, well, that's the cashing portion of a tournament field, right? The top 20% finish in the money. And if Spencer Rattler is the way to go at quarterback this week, like definitively the way to go at quarterback this week, and you don't have him, then you're behind the field. But also there are ways in which Spencer Rattler could be a completely poor way to build. And always we want to be thinking not about predicting what's going to happen, but understanding the range of ways that things could play out and the nuance involved in these situations and how we can position ourselves to best benefit from the different ways that things could play out. So how does Spencer Rattler end up being one of the top plays on the slate? How do Spencer Rattler rosters end up being one of the best ways to build on this slate? Well, obviously, one way is he puts up 22 to 25 DraftKings points at only 4K in salary. So first, let's talk about the chances of that happening. Well, Spencer Rattler, 5th round rookie, making his first career start, playing against Todd Bowles, a blitz-happy defense that has tended to give rookie quarterbacks a lot of problems. The only rookie quarterback that has not had problems with him has been Bo Nix. This is throughout like a long span of Todd Bowles defenses, and that's a Bo Nix, that's a Sean Payton offense where Sean Payton has always done really well against Todd Bowles. So outside of that very unique situation, we can typically expect rookie quarterbacks to struggle. We also have Spencer Rattler. He's primarily played in shotgun at South Carolina, at Oklahoma, and this Saints offense, everything is built off of this run scheme. All the passing concepts are built off the run scheme, and the run scheme is primarily built from under center. So a very unique situation here in that the Saints are the Saints offensive line came into the season, we were expecting them to not be good. They played really well the first couple of games, but then started getting hit by injuries, and now they're playing really poorly. And so what helps that offensive line do well is this run game, right? Because if you can get the defense's outside zone run game and you build your passing concepts off of that, that keeps the defense off balance enough. They have to worry about gap integrity. They have to worry about how they're handling the run game and make sure they're not giving up these big plays in the run game, which kind of slows down their ability to rush the passer. And so if this is a situation where the Saints are unable to get their run game going, then it's a situation where it's a much tougher game for Spencer Rattler because the Bucs know that he's going to be passing the ball, and the Bucs can pin their ears back and attack against an offensive line that's not playing well. And so lots of ways that this could go sideways or go downhill for Spencer Rattler. So it's not probable that Spencer Rattler puts up 22 to 25 DraftKings points. So you can play him and hope that that happens. But really, if you're playing him, you don't want to bet on that scenario. So how else do Spencer Rattler rosters end up being the best way to build on this slate? So sort of the entry level thought here would be, well, even if he puts up 14, 16, 18 points, how many other 4K players are going to put up 14, 16, 18 points, right? Take away position and just think about raw points. That can end up separating, right? If most of the field is getting 4 points, 6 points, 8 points, occasionally 10, 11 points from their cheaper pieces, and Spencer Rattler's putting up 15, 16, 17 points, well, that's a nice little bit of separation that you're getting there. So that's one side of things. The other side of things, though, is especially when we're dealing with the quarterback position, we can't completely remove the positional component because you can only play one quarterback. And that means that if you're playing Spencer Rattler, you are not playing Dak Prescott. If you're playing Spencer Rattler, you're not playing Lamar Jackson. If you're playing Spencer Rattler, you're not playing Jaden Daniels or one of these other quarterbacks who could end up putting up a big game. So if, let's say Lamar Jackson puts up 35 DraftKings points. Let's say that Dak Prescott puts up 32 DraftKings points. Well, okay, let's actually take the Dak example. If Dak's putting up 32 DraftKings points, that probably means that CeeDee Lamb is putting up 35 DraftKings points of his own. So yes, you can get CeeDee Lamb on your Rattler roster, but you cannot get Dak Prescott. So Dak Prescott plus CeeDee Lamb plus a 4K piece that scores 10 points. Now, you might look at this and say, yeah, but I can't guess which 4K piece is going to score 10 points. Maybe not, but somebody in the tournament you're competing against will be able to guess correctly on the 4K piece that scores 10 points. So all of a sudden we're looking at, you've got 67 points, 77 points when you have that 10 points from the 4K piece. So the Spencer Rattler roster, yes, it can get the 35 points from CeeDee Lamb, and let's say you get 16 points from Spencer Rattler, so that's 51 points. But now you're still 26 points behind the Dak CeeDee Lamb cheap piece who underperforms what Spencer Rattler does combination, right? And you have to find that Dak is 6.7K, right? So you've got to find that 6.5K, 6.7K, 7K player who puts up 26 points in order to catch what Dak, CeeDee Lamb, and this other piece do. So even though you might get a lower score than Spencer Rattler with your 4K piece, you could still be ahead of the Spencer Rattler rosters if Dak ends up hitting at this high level, if Lamar Jackson ends up hitting at this high level, because those Spencer Rattler rosters, yes, they gain 4 or 5 or 6 points, but now they've got to match whatever Lamar Jackson does, whatever Dak Prescott does, and they're not able to get that. Let's say that CeeDee Lamb did it multiple times last year, 44, 45 points. Let's say that he puts up a score like that and no other skill position players top 30, which could very easily happen on this slate, right? If Lamar Jackson goes for 35, 37, then Derrick Henry's probably not topping 30. Most games, Amon-Ra St. Brown is not topping 30. Most games, A.J. Brown is not topping 22 or 23 points, let alone 30. So very easily this slate could play out in such a way that none of these other guys are putting up more than 30 points. And the only 30-plus point scores you're getting are from CeeDee Lamb and Dak and Lamar or Jaden Daniels or however this shakes out. And so there's certainly opportunity if one of these other quarterbacks puts up a 30-plus point score for the Spencer Rattler rosters to be behind those rosters, maybe ahead of the field, because for 4K, you're getting a better score than other people are getting for their 4K at a different position. But in terms of trying to win a tournament, you might be way behind the chunk of the field that has the right quarterbacks, the quarterbacks who scored 30, 35 plus points. So all that to say, how do Spencer Rattler rosters become the way to build for tournament wins this week? You probably need no other quarterbacks to top like 26, 27, 28 DraftKings points. So if Dak goes for 26, 27 DraftKings points, if Lamar goes for 28 DraftKings points, if Jaden Daniels goes for 25 DraftKings points, that's not a big deal, right? Because now you're probably outperforming the other 4K pieces at other positions with Spencer Rattler. And you can find another piece in that similar price range that scores similar to what Dak and Lamar Jackson end up scoring. And so it's kind of a question of, if you're playing Spencer Rattler, you're probably not betting on him putting up 22 to 25 DraftKings points. You're probably saying, what's his high end for passing yards? 225 passing yards would be a really good game for Spencer Rattler in the spot. Well, that's 9 DraftKings points. You probably are going to get at least 1 turnover from him. So bump him down to 8. Maybe he picks up 15 or 20 rushing yards. So add 2 points. Maybe he gets 10 points. So then how many touchdowns can he score in this spot? Is he going to throw for 3 touchdowns and score 22 DraftKings points? Probably not, right? So you're probably getting 14, 18, 16 points, somewhere in that range. And so you want to think about your Spencer Rattler rosters, in my opinion, not through the lens of what if he does put up 25? And instead think if he puts up 22, 25, like, what a bonus that is for me. But instead, you want to be thinking about he probably puts up 14, 16, 18 in a good game. And so where is the edge? The edge is in these other quarterbacks underperforming. So if these other quarterbacks underperform, the next question you want to ask is, do we think that offense as a whole underperforms? Do we think that the Cowboys as a whole underperform? Do we think that the Ravens as a whole underperform? Or do we think that those offenses still do well and the points come through somebody else? So with the Cowboys have not looked like themselves on offense so far this year. The Lions are occasionally a really good defense. There's certainly potential that the Lions, who, should have gone to the Super Bowl last year, blew that second half lead, went to the NFC Championship game, blew that second half lead, and have gotten better in the offseason, or look like a better team this year than they were last year. There's certainly a chance that the Lions are Super Bowl contenders, and that the Cowboys, who have, kind of in the offseason, it was like, looks like the Cowboys got worse on paper than last year. And so far this year, they've played like they got worse on paper than last year. There's certainly a chance that the Lions completely control this game, right? So you could play Spencer Rattler and then not account for other Cowboys pieces on your roster and just say, man, I'm just going to bet on Spencer Rattler having a 16-point game and Dak underwhelming against this Lions defense, right? That's viable. You could also place Rico Dowdle on those rosters, going to be lower owned, and he could take the touchdowns away from Dak if that game is high scoring and competitive. Cowboys are scoring points, but the touchdowns come on the ground. Rico Dowdle is going to be low owned, I would have to imagine. And so that also separates your Spencer Rattler rosters a little bit. You're accounting for how the Cowboys could succeed, not through Dak. And then you get Rico Dowdle. Well, one thing I would not want to do is play CeeDee Lamb on my Spencer Rattler rosters. In fact, let me make a quick note here for myself to add that rule in the Bink machine in the optimizer that I don't want any Lamb on my Rattler rosters, or at least very little Lamb on my Rattler rosters, because CeeDee Lamb, he hit for 32 plus DraftKings points 6 times last year. In all 6 of those games, you wanted to pair him with Dak Prescott. So there was one where Dak scored 24, one where Dak scored 26, but the others he was scoring 32, he was scoring 35, he scored 41 in one of those games. And so if CeeDee Lamb is hitting for a tournament winning score, well, Dak Prescott's probably separating from Spencer Rattler in that scenario. And so you actually want Dak Prescott instead of Spencer Rattler. So some of the things that we want to think about on these types of rosters, but on a Rattler roster, playing Rico Dowdle could be a way to go. Playing Derrick Henry is a really sharp way to go, because we're probably not expecting the Ravens to have a hard time scoring points against Washington. And so if Dak Prescott is not separating from Spencer Rattler rosters, if he's scoring 22 DraftKings points, 25, 26 DraftKings points, well, that's probably not because the Ravens just underwhelm. It's likely to be because Derrick Henry is the guy picking up the yards. Derrick Henry is the guy scoring the touchdowns. And so adding Derrick Henry to one of these Spencer Rattler rosters is another way to think about this. So do we play Spencer Rattler? Do we not play Spencer Rattler? To me, it's not a situation where I want to take a stand and die on this hill and say, man, Spencer Rattler's a great way to play this roster. Not a situation where I want to completely fade him and say, oh, I don't think he's going to have a good game in this spot. I don't think he's going to put up 20 plus DraftKings points, but instead recognize that there are ways this slate could play out such that Spencer Rattler rosters win you tournaments. There are ways this slate plays out such that Spencer Rattler rosters are not rosters you want to have. And so I want to account for both of those scenarios. And rather than trying to predict what's going to happen, I want to position myself for what could happen. So even if you're a single entry 3-max player, for me, my single entry 3-max, I usually have 10 to 13 rosters that I use in single entry 3-max, which allows me to play this game of percentages. So even if you're single entry 3-max, that's one way you can approach things in order to do that. I'll probably have say I have 13 single entry 3-max rosters this week. I could see myself having 1 or 2 rosters with Spencer Rattler, and using, instead of just saying, oh, maybe he's the way to go, understanding if he's the way to go, it's probably because of these certain elements in terms of how the rest of the slate plays out. And I can then account for that on those rosters and have better built Spencer Rattler rosters than the field, and then have other rosters that account for other ways that the slate could play out, game shooting out, needing a quarterback who ends up scoring 30, 35 plus DraftKings points. So again, not necessarily about predicting what we think is going to happen, but instead understanding what can happen and positioning ourselves for what can happen. Next question on this slate. So we're talking about Spencer Rattler being 4K. Is there other value on this slate? This is actually a really interesting week with, it's week 6, injuries are piling up. Some of it, we're not going to know the answers until Sunday morning or Saturday night. We get maybe a Schefter bomb on Saturday night. But let's go position by position, we'll go running back, wide receiver, and then talk about different spots where some injuries are potentially opening up value. So first off, Washington backfield, Brian Robinson, I think he had 7 carries last week, and now he, being called a game time decision. It looks like even if he plays, he's not going to see a hefty workload. And we could have a spot where Washington is potentially trailing and having to throw the ball a little bit more. And so that lends itself more to Austin Eckler, Jeremy McNichols being in there. And we could have Brian Robinson Jr. being inactive this week for the Washington-Baltimore game. So that might be news we don't get until an hour and a half before kickoff. But if we get that news, Brian Robinson Jr. is out, there's certainly potential for Austin Eckler or even Jeremy McNichols to put up a tournament contending type of score this week and to be somewhat low owned and to come in with, they both have relatively low price tags. Then we have the New England backfield where Ramondre Stevenson's status is up in the air. Really bad matchup against an excellent Houston defense, top 3 in defensive DVOA, one of the best run defenses in the NFL last year and so far this year. So not a great spot for Antonio Gibson. We would expect the Patriots to be trailing, not a good spot for them to run the ball. But if Antonio Gibson's out, if Ramondre Stevenson's out, that opens up a lot of potential work for an inexpensive back in Antonio Gibson. Then we have the Tampa backfield. We don't know yet if Rachaad White's going to play, and maybe we'll get some news. This is Friday morning when I record this, and practice reports are kind of coming out as I'm recording this. So maybe by the time you're watching this, we do have news. We know that Rachaad White's going to play, but if he doesn't, we have this opportunity for Bucky Irving, who has looked much better, to have the role that Rachaad White had last year. So if you remember last year, Rachaad White wasn't really playing all that well all season long. Why was he valuable in DFS week in and week out? Was because of this role that he had. Why did he enter this season as somebody that people were willing to draft relatively high? Because of this role that he had week in and week out, where he was so central to the offense. He was on the field all the time. He's involved in the passing attack. He's the one getting the carries. Well, this year, he hasn't been valuable in DFS in fantasy because Bucky Irving has been eating into that workload. But we would have to assume that if Rachaad White's out, there's a pretty good chance that Bucky Irving takes on that 2023 Rachaad White role where he's on the field all the time. He's getting the pass game work. He's getting the carries. He's getting the opportunities inside the 10-yard line and has those opportunities for touchdowns. And so Bucky Irving would become really interesting value here. And I want to highlight, like, Spencer Rattler is 4K, right? Like, Andy Dalton's 5,200. Bucky Irving is 5,400. Some of these opportunities where it's like, yeah, they're more expensive than Spencer Rattler, but how much more expensive? How much is that really changing what you can do on the rest of your roster? And so there is opportunity to find some value in this 5K range where, instead of going Spencer Rattler and some 6K guy, you have a couple of these guys in the 5K range and you're paying the same amount for these two guys as somebody else is paying for Spencer Rattler, and like a 6-point Spencer Rattler and Bijan Robinson, right, is going to be 10.6K in salary. And if you instead go, okay, you know what, I don't get Bijan Robinson on this roster, but I get Bucky Irving and Antonio Gibson. That's basically the same price that you're paying and allows you to then have the same flexibility on the rest of that roster that a Spencer Rattler roster would have. So just some of this value is interesting to be thinking about as we move deeper into this week. Indianapolis backfield looks like no Jonathan Taylor again this week. So Trey Sermon last week kind of bailed out people who rostered him because of all the catches and scored the touchdown. Not a great running back and hasn't been throughout his career, but still a guy who's going to be on the field and potential to provide some value. So next one, Pittsburgh backfield. So while I was on my show with Pete Overzet, he brought up that supposedly Jaylen Warren practiced in full on Friday. He was supposed to be doubtful for this game. So, we're still kind of waiting to see how that plays out. Najee Harris has not looked good. Mentioned in DFS interpretations this week that I believe it's in his last 41 games, he's topped 20 DraftKings points 4 times. So, not a guy that's likely to win you a tournament, but very much in the mix of like, hey, injuries and there's volume, and he's a guy to consider at these lower price tags. So that's another injury spot where we're waiting for news, waiting to see how that plays out. And then we have the Las Vegas backfield where it looks like Zamir White will miss once again. And does that mean that we get, valuable production? Probably not. But again, place where we're getting kind of cheap opportunities due to injuries. Then over at pass catchers, we actually have some really interesting setups at wide receiver, tight end with potential injuries. So we'll start out with the Houston pass catchers. We know that Nico Collins obviously has dominated work for the Texans, has dominated upside looks for the Texans. Nico Collins is on injured reserve now. And so that leaves us with, yes, Stephon Diggs and Tank Dell. And Tank Dell in particular might prove to be underpriced on this particular slate, but it also brings out, Dalton Schultz, who last year had 9+ DraftKings points, and I think it was 13 out of 17 games. And this year hasn't hit 9+ DraftKings points once. Well, this year he's got 3 wide receivers to contend with instead of 2 wide receivers to contend with. So this is a spot where Dalton Schultz, his price has dropped based on his role being smaller this year, but all of a sudden we could see him stepping into a role similar to what he had last year. And then Robert Woods looks like he's going to miss this week as well. So number 3 wide receiver on this offense, not going to see a lot of schemed looks no matter what. Robert Woods in particular, not going to see a lot of schemed looks. Robert Woods is the guy they really like inside that building. He is there to be a leadership presence. And then obviously if there's injuries, he gets his time on the field. But if Robert Woods misses, all of a sudden now we have Xavier Hutchinson stepping into that wide receiver 3 role. And just a guy who's on the field a lot for an offense that's capable of scoring points. And those are the types of guys who can trip into really good production. Not something that you can project him to have a big game, but he's the type of guy who, if you need some deep salary relief in large field tournaments, you can throw somebody like that onto a roster. Indianapolis, don't really know what's going on here. It looked like Michael Pittman, they were saying he might have to go on IR, and then all of a sudden on Friday, he returned to practice. Josh Downs missed 2 practices with his toe injury, but returned to practice on Friday. It looks like Downs will play. Anthony Richardson's a game time decision. I mean, all sorts of stuff is up in the air here. So Anthony Richardson, I said last week that, heading into the week, and I said, I really think Flacco's going to play here, but why would the Colts show their hand, right? And people joke about competitive advantage with injury reports and all that. But realistically, if you have 2 completely different styles of quarterback, if it's Anthony Richardson versus Joe Flacco, who are about as different as can be, and you force the opponent to have to prepare, you force the opposing defensive coaching staff to have to think through game plans for both sides and how they're going to divvy up their practice reps and their training and what they're teaching their players for that particular week on how they want to win that game between 2 very different types of quarterbacks, that does have edge in it, right? There is advantage in forcing the opponent to do that. So it makes all the sense in the world for the Colts to kind of draw out those decisions. Came out after last week that Anthony Richardson said he was never close to playing last week. And yet for the Colts, it was a game time decision. Well, this week, Anthony Richardson practiced in full. I believe it was on Thursday and maybe it was again on Friday, but they are calling him a game time decision once again. So I'm reading this week as Anthony Richardson is going to play. It's a game time decision because they want to force the opponent to wait until the last minute to know how the Colts are going to attack in this spot. But we'll have to see how that plays out. We don't know about Michael Pittman either, but let's assume that Michael Pittman is out. Well, Anthony Richardson stepping in, Michael Pittman out. Obviously, this lowers the passing volume. It lowers the accuracy of the passes being thrown, but it elevates Josh Downs' role and makes him kind of interesting. But also what this would do that I think is the most interesting trickle-down effect is it puts A.D. Mitchell on the field all the time for the Colts. Now, they've got a lot of tight ends they like. They're going to run some 3 tight end sets. A.D. Mitchell's not going to be out there 90% of the snaps, but he could be out there in a 55 or 60% snap share type of situation. And that's what we had when Josh Downs was out. Obviously, Alec Pierce is going to continue to be the downfield threat, but Alec Pierce doesn't work in the short areas of the field, right? He's only a downfield threat is how the Colts use him in this offense. And so we would have this opportunity for A.D. Mitchell, who can work downfield, can also work underneath, has been getting absolutely wide open this season, has a tremendous number of air yards, keeps having these missed connections with Anthony Richardson, had multiple opportunities for big games in those first couple weeks of the season and just failed to connect. And the issue with some of the suppositions around this offense is the issues with A.D. Mitchell is that a lot of times he's not actually running the route he's supposed to run, and yet he's getting wide open, right? And so if he's on the field, when he's on the field, he commands targets, just ridiculous targets per route run rate. So if he's on the field a lot this week, he's kind of a sneaky guy who could help you win a tournament in that he could get wide open and hit for one of these 60, 70-yard plays that Alec Pierce has been hitting for and add 2 or 3 additional catches from there. All of a sudden, he's sitting on 4 catches for 110 yards and a touchdown as a guy that nobody's playing. That's 24 DraftKings points. So he's a guy who becomes very interesting this week if Michael Pittman misses. And on the off chance that we get Michael Pittman and Josh Downs missing, then A.D. Mitchell would become one of my favorite plays on the slate. I don't think that will happen, but just something that I want to mention. And then we have the Las Vegas pass catchers where Devontae Adams still out. Trey Tucker still 4,200. Trey Tucker now not playing the Denver pass defense. Yes, Pittsburgh is a good defense, but Pittsburgh isn't this elite pass defense that Denver has. And so Trey Tucker 4,200, even Jacoby Myers kind of underpriced. Obviously, Brock Bowers, focal point of this offense, but these other two guys have a little bit of value to them. And then I also just want to mention there's just some pure mispricings on the Atlanta pass catchers. So we got to keep in mind Kirk Cousins threw the ball 58 times last week. Typically, I used this example when talking to Pete earlier today, but so CeeDee Lamb hit for 32 plus DraftKings points 6 times last year. In all 6 of those, Dak also hit. And in all 6 of those, you could have added Brandon Cooks or Jake Ferguson to that stack and gone Dak plus CD plus another pass catcher and stayed on a 4x or more salary pace, 80 plus DraftKings points in those games. And so that's because when you are like when CeeDee Lamb's hitting for 32 plus DraftKings points, it's usually because Dak is throwing the ball that much more and CeeDee Lamb's seeing that many more targets. Well, if Dak is throwing the ball that much more, it opens opportunities for the other pieces on the offense to get that spillover volume and value as well, which is why you see these double stacks end up working, or you see Joe Burrow, T. Higgins, Jamar Chase last week, or you see the week when Geno Smith threw the ball 58 times. You see the week when Jordan Love threw the ball 54 times. You see the week when Kirk Cousins threw the ball 58 times. CJ Stroud threw the ball 42 times. Like when these things happen, you end up with opportunities for lots of different pieces to hit because the volume is elevated across the board. So I think one of the things that people are going to overlook with Ray McLeod and Darnell Mooney is McLeod had his best game of the season last week. Mooney had his best game of the season last week. Pitts had his best game of the season last week. Drake London had his best game of the season last week. Kirk Cousins threw the ball 58 times, right? So that rising tide of volume from the quarterback lifts all boats. And if Kirk Cousins throws the ball 30 to 32 to 34 times in this spot, then it's likely that none of these guys return tournament winning scores. And if any of them do, it's just because they are the ones who trip into a touchdown or a broken play or end up scoring 2 touchdowns unpredictably. And so what we're really looking for is the spots where volume can elevate, because those are the spots where you really get these big score opportunities from pass catchers. But at the same time, Ray McLeod and Darnell Mooney are just very fundamentally underpriced for the roles that they have in that offense. And so a couple other guys I wanted to kind of lay out those facts and figures around it as well, so that you kind of are able to see that through a nuanced lens, as opposed to just, I think the field is going to look at it as like, man, look what these guys did last week. Look at their price tags, and you got to play them. The likeliest scenario is that Cousins throws it 30 to 32 to 34 times, and that these guys underwhelm. Now, we had the same thing last week with Jordan Love, where it was like he was coming off the 54 pass attempt game. Everyone wanted to play pass catchers on that Packers offense. And we kept saying last week, like, he's probably going to throw it 30 to 34 times in this spot. He ended up throwing it 26 times. At the same time, Tucker Kraft was able to get 5 targets, catch 4 of them, or was it 4 targets, and catch 4 of them and go for 78 yards and 2 touchdowns, because he had a busted play where he picks up 66 yards on one play. So it's still possible that you can hit a tournament winning score from one of these pieces on limited volume, but you need a lot more things to go right in order to get that tournament winners, is what we want to think about there. So like the mispricing on there, but wanted to also kind of mention the thoughts around that. And then we have potential mispricings. I'm just going to roll through some guys here who are not necessarily due to injury, but potential mispricings on Noah Brown against Baltimore. If he comes back this week, he was functioning as the wide receiver 2 in that offense. I think it was 60 to 70% of snaps. And in this spot where, Baltimore could jump out to a lead, Washington could be chasing points as opposed to playing from ahead. And this could be an opportunity for Noah Brown to see 6 or 7 targets for the first time this season. Baltimore tight ends against Washington. We've got the 29-pointer from Isaiah Likely, the 16-pointer last week from Isaiah Likely. Mark Andrews had 9-point-something points last week, had 5 catches. And there's going to be a week this season in which Mark Andrews puts up 16 plus DraftKings points, maybe 18, maybe 20 plus DraftKings points. So Baltimore tight ends from a ceiling perspective, underpriced on the slate. Michael Wilson against Green Bay. Michael Wilson, his role is about 75% of Marvin Harrison Jr.'s role in terms of targets, in terms of air yards, and yet his price is 64% of Marvin Harrison Jr.'s price. So either Marvin Harrison Jr. is overpriced and his price needs to start trickling down, or what I think is likelier, Marvin Harrison Jr. will hit enough big games. He's going to stay in this like low 7K, maybe even the mid 7K range. And Michael Wilson is going to see his price start creeping up. And that's what I expect to happen. So Michael Wilson probably underpriced by about 800 or so on this slate as well. And then ceiling plays against Arizona, or ceiling plays on Washington versus Arizona, but Washington's not playing Arizona, on Green Bay versus Arizona. So in terms of Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, these guys are like massively unpredictable. Even Tucker Kraft, right? You cannot predict that they're going to have a big game, and yet there is clear potential for them to have a big game. So we're now at 13 of Jordan Love's last 14 games. 13 out of 14, at least one pass catcher on the Packers has scored 17.9 or more DraftKings points. So if that ends up being Jaden Reed, and there is no tournament winner from this offense, and it's 18 DraftKings points or 22 DraftKings points, well, whatever, he costs 7K, that's not doing much for you. But if it's not Jaden Reed, if Jaden Reed scores 12, 15 DraftKings points, and it's somebody else who scores 18, 20, 22, 24, well, that somebody else is underpriced for that production. So another thing that we can be thinking about this week, sort of a long shot bet, we've got the Patriots wideouts against Houston. Drake May starting. The Patriots offensive line has been really bad this year. So how much time can Drake May have for plays to develop downfield? We don't know. Maybe very little. But at the same time, Houston, who's really good on defense, last week, Mac Hollins and Josh Allen failed to connect on what would have been a huge play. Week 1, A.D. Mitchell and Anthony Richardson failed to connect on 2 different plays that would have been huge plays. There were situations in every single game this season in which at least one play, somebody was wide open downfield and their quarterback completely missed them against Houston. So yes, Houston has looked really good on defense. Yes, their numbers look really good, but also like the pendulum could have swung a different way and the stats against them would look very different because of these big plays. And so there's certainly opportunity for Jalen Polk or Kendrick Bourne. Kendrick Bourne played 16 snaps last week, his first game back from his torn ACL, wasn't it? So, that's something that you kind of get a little bit of ramp up time. So maybe he doesn't get, full workload this week. So Jalen Polk, the likelier guy to hit there. Obviously, neither guy is super likely, but in terms of just hunting for value, especially in large field tournaments, you want value that has pathways to 20 plus DraftKings points. And these guys certainly have that within their range. Then we've got the Titans. Tony Pollard, underpriced for his role and upside, as are DeAndre Hopkins and Calvin Ridley in this matchup against this Indianapolis defense that has not played well this year. So the floor is really low, and because of that, people want to stay away. But when the floor is low, but the ceiling is high, it's worth thinking about those guys. Already mentioned Darnell Mooney and Ray McLeod. Also want to mention Kyle Pitts against Carolina, underpriced. Deontay Johnson, Chuba Hubbard, both still underpriced for the way this offense has performed with Andy Dalton under center and for the potential in that game environment. And then if this game shoots out, this Dallas and Detroit game, if it shoots out, Jameson Williams has a chance to be underpriced. Sam Laporta has a chance to be underpriced. Jalen Tolbert and Jake Ferguson, they all have a chance to be underpriced in this spot. So it might look like a week without a lot of value because there's not sub 5K running backs that stand out as really sharp plays. And there are not sub 4,200 wide receivers that stand out as really sharp plays, but there are a lot of spots this week that could generate some nice scores for the salary that you're spending. And it's likely that there's enough spots that it's likely that some of them do end up hitting. And so sort of mixing and matching some of these spots, not a bad way to go, because if you hit on the right one, then that opens up a lot elsewhere on your roster. So that brings us over to this Detroit and Dallas game. And I kind of see it like this. So we said at the top that we're going to talk about one key decision point with Spencer Rattler and then close out before our bottom up build with another couple of key decision points. So these other 2 key decision points for me are the Detroit-Dallas game and the Washington-Baltimore game. And it's like this. Baltimore's probably going to score points. So if it's not through Lamar Jackson, it's probably through Derrick Henry, right? That's something you want to think about on this spot. Detroit-Dallas has a very broad range of ways in which it could play out. It could actually be a low-scoring game. It could be a game Detroit dominates. Unlikely, but there's an outside shot that it's a game Dallas dominates. But also within this range of outcomes is this being a real, true shootout and a game that you had to have in order to compete this week. And so to me, every roster is either playing Dak or Lamar, or it's fading Dak or Lamar. In other words, rosters that do not have these guys, I am treating those as fades. I'm treating those as me saying, okay, Cowboys and Lions doesn't shoot out, or the Cowboys don't score a lot of points. Or it's me saying Baltimore scores their points not through Lamar Jackson, or Baltimore scores their points, but it's not enough for any of these guys to really justify placement on a roster at their salaries. And so I want to be thinking through that lens of like, it's not guaranteed that Baltimore puts up 30 plus real life points. It's not even probable that Dallas puts up 30 plus real life points, but it is somewhat likely that Baltimore does it. It might even be probable that Baltimore does it. And it's well within the range of outcomes that Dallas does it. And so I want to be accounting for that on rosters where I'm not using those guys. So Washington, Baltimore, a game where primarily the Baltimore side is the one that I'm going to be paying attention to. 4 out of 5 games now, Lamar plus somebody else from that offense has gone for 59.4 or more DraftKings points. So it's been Lamar plus Derrick Henry twice. It's been Lamar plus Isaiah Likely once, and it's been Lamar plus Zay Flowers once. Detroit produced at least 12 games last year of 25.9 or more DraftKings points from individual pieces, which is way above most other teams in the league. Dallas had 6 games of Dak plus CeeDee Lamb plus the third piece going for 4x or more their salary, and most of those games were at home. So again, 2 games I really want to be paying attention to, and then 2 other games behind that, Atlanta and Carolina. So Carolina obviously has allowed point totals of 47, 26, 22, 34, and 36. Atlanta is off the top of my head, but I think they scored in order. It's like ascending order throughout the season. I think they scored 18, 21, 22, 24 in their first 4 games, but 3 of those were against really good defenses. It's a new coach. It's a new offensive system for Kirk Cousins, so to speak, new players that he's getting used to. So it would make sense for them to round into form as we get deeper into the season. And then this is a really soft matchup for them. So certainly potential for Atlanta to do really well here. And then Dalton stacks, right? Dalton plus Deontay Johnson plus Chuba Hubbard. Those first 2 games when they were playing softer defenses went for 87.6 DraftKings points and 63.1. So they're 17.6K in salary. And, if they get 63.1, that's a little below the pace that you want. If they were to get 87.6, that's way above the pace that you need from these 3 guys. And they're probably not getting up to that type of score. But even if they get up into this, 68, 69, 70 point range, that's really nice. That's 17.6K in salary. So, like I said, Dalton's only 1,200 more than Spencer Rattler. You tie him in with 2 underpriced pieces that are probably benefiting if he's benefiting. And that's, provides some really nice ways to play that. You get a cheap Atlanta piece as a bring back, and you can still do a lot on the rest of those rosters. And then we have the last game I want to hit on, which is I'm labeling it as high probability of solid points, but lower likelihood of a shootout. And that is this Arizona Green Bay game. So just the nature of the way that both of these teams play, we're unlikely to have a 31-38 type of game, the type of game that we saw with the Colts and Jags last week, the type of game that we saw with Baltimore and Cincinnati last week, the type of game that we might not get anywhere this week, but that we could get from Washington, Baltimore, that we could get from Detroit, Dallas. And so Arizona Green Bay is one of these spots where, in order for it to be the spot you were supposed to be building around in order to win a tournament, you probably need these other games to underwhelm, because this game is probably not going to turn into an all-time shootout, a 38-42 type of game that we're still talking about 6 weeks from now. If this is the game that wins you a tournament, it's probably because this game combines for 55 to 60 points, and the other games that have potential to combine for 70, 75, 80 points fall short of those marks, maybe dramatically short of those marks. So this is kind of the 4th game that I really like. But in this game, I see it as a game that has a very low probability of just like massively ascending. And so you kind of need some other spots to work in your favor as well in order for this to be the roster that helps you win a tournament. So with that, let's turn the page to the bottom-up build. If you are new here, bottom-up build, we're going to build a roster with a 44K salary cap. So what this allows us to do is play around with some value, talk through some different angles, also talk through some strategy of how we would build this roster. Basically saying, if we were in a contest where everybody had a 44K salary cap, what are some of the strategy angles that we would be playing around with or thinking about here? And then if you want to play in a contest with a 44K salary cap, you can do that. We have the bottom-up build contest. It is always linked in my player grid in the scroll on 1 week season. Also in the OWS Discord, there's a BUB channel where you can find the link to the bottom-up build every week. Free to enter, build with a 44K salary cap. We have real money prizes on the site for winners, free courses and whatnot. First place is $150 worth of free courses on the site. So fun contest to play every week and a good exercise for your brain every week. So my bottom-up build contest. So this roster has a starting point of Andy Dalton, Chuba Hubbard, and Deontay Johnson. So again, this three-player combination cost $17.6K in salary. They played the Bears last week. Bears ranked 7th in defensive DVOA. This week they're playing Atlanta. Atlanta ranks 20th. So not nearly the challenge that they had last week. Against a Raiders team that ranks 29th in defensive DVOA. They put up, over 80 combined points among the three of these guys. And against a Bengals team that ranks 22nd in defensive DVOA, they put up 63 combined points among them. So even 63 points is keeping you on like about 175 point pace. And if you get up to that 70 point and above mark, then you're keeping yourself on a 200 point and above pace. So just a really nice setup in this spot where we expect Atlanta to be able to score. Atlanta's defense 31st in pressure rate. So, the Panthers, one of the things they've had going for them this year is really one of the best offensive lines in football, but they're now dealing with injuries, which is going to hurt them against teams that have a pass rush. Atlanta does not have a pass rush so far this year. So certainly an opportunity for the Panthers to do well in this spot. Now, if I'm playing this, I also want to have a bring back from the Falcons side of the ball. So I'm going to go with Bijan Robinson on this particular roster. Going to be popular this week. There are some downsides to this play, but also the ceiling is really high on this play. So I'll touch on it more deeply in the player grid. I touched on it in DFS interpretations as well. So with this starting point, 44K salary cap, obviously we still have some salary that we need to save because, Dalton, Hubbard, Deontay Johnson, Bijan Robinson, we're kind of paying about 6K per player here. So even though these guys are cheap in the context of the main slate, we start to squeeze our salary a little bit here. So next thing I did on this roster was put in the Buccaneers defense. So basically betting against Spencer Rattler, betting on this Bucs defense having a good game in this spot. They're probably going to be a popular defense, but nice leverage off the Spencer Rattler rosters. And something I particularly wanted to do in a 44K salary cap contest where you would assume that, obviously, as we always say, the only 44K salary cap contest that exists is an OWS contest. And most people who play it have listened to this podcast, so that warps ownership from there. But if it were just like a pure 44K salary cap contest, you would assume that a lot of people would be playing Spencer Rattler because he's this big value play on the slate, right? So we're able to play a different quarterback value and say, man, if Dalton just outscores Rattler by 3, 4, 5 points, we're pretty far ahead of those Rattler rosters. And then we also play the Bucs defense to get leverage off of, take points away from Spencer Rattler. As in, if the Bucs are getting sacks and turnovers, that's lowering the opportunity. That's, negative points on the turnovers for Rattler and taking away opportunities for that Saints offense to score touchdowns every time that there's a sack, because that often kills drives. And so Buccaneers defense is a nice way to play off of Spencer Rattler rosters, and obviously just a sharp play in a vacuum this week as well. Now we've got to save salary in other spots. So I don't want to totally discount the potential for the Cowboys to be scoring a lot of points in this spot. So I'm going to put Jalen Tolbert on this roster again, just talking about guys who are underpriced. Now, if Jalen Tolbert is hitting, similar to what we talked about earlier, where it's probably because there's lots of volume on this offense. CeeDee Lamb is probably also hitting. Dak Prescott's probably also hitting, but there was no way for me to get that three-player combination onto a 44K salary cap roster and feel good about it. If you're able to do it, then shout out to you. That might be what's required in order to win this week. But Jalen Tolbert allows me to say, okay, we're working with a smaller salary cap here. Yes, this Jalen Tolbert bet is functionally betting on Dak Prescott also having a good game, functionally betting on CeeDee Lamb also having a good game, but I can get that production without getting those guys or paying the salary for those guys and sacrificing everything else on my roster to get those guys. And, there's a chance that Chuba Hubbard, Deontay Johnson, Andy Dalton, in terms of a point per dollar pace, are able to perform at the same level as that Dak to CeeDee Lamb connection. And I get the Jalen Tolbert points here. And then we've got Dalton Schultz. We already touched on him, kind of underpriced. A.D. Mitchell, who again, just a lot of upside in this spot, low floor, but a lot of ceiling on this A.D. Mitchell play, and would be, again, if I weren't mentioning in this podcast, maybe people won't play him anyway, but if this were just a pure 44K salary cap contest, then, if this were something that were available in the industry, then people would probably not be looking at A.D. Mitchell. And he's a guy who can put up 25 DraftKings points and could really separate from the field. So nice guy to play here. And then wrap it up with Trey Tucker, 4,200, still going to have this role in this offense with like a better pure passer in Aiden O'Connell getting the ball to him. Not that it necessarily matters. I mean, it's kind of a broken offense anyway. Not a great matchup against Pittsburgh, but they're going to have to pass the ball some, and Trey Tucker is going to be involved. So in all, that gives us Andy Dalton, Chuba Hubbard, Bijan Robinson, Deontay Johnson, A.D. Mitchell, Jalen Tolbert, Dalton Schultz, Trey Tucker, and the Buccaneers defense spending exactly $44K in salary, giving us $6K left over. As always, one of the coolest things we see in the bottom up build contest is every once in a while we get 190, 200 point scores from these 44K salary cap rosters. We've had weeks where people finish in the top 3 in the bottom up build, and their roster in the bottom up build outscored their best rosters on the main slate in the 50K salary cap contest. So again, it's just a great exercise to think about how you can squeeze ceiling onto these rosters with only 44K in salary spent. And then you can kind of, from there, you start to realize, oh, this slate has a little bit more flexibility than I thought. And you can get up that 50K salary cap mark from there. So fun exercise, something I encourage you to do. And with that, I am going to get out of here. As always, I want to encourage you to head over to RotoGrinders YouTube channel, I guess is where it is. But RotoGrinders and find the Solo Ship podcast with myself and Squirrel Patrol. By the time this is available to you, that should also be available to you. That airs live at 3:30 p.m. Eastern and can be accessed, not live immediately after that. Check out Searching for Ceiling with Hilo and Lord Reeves. Always one of my favorite listens each week. Check out the site, the content on the site. If you are not a paid member of OWS, all the game breakdowns are free in the NFL Edge, and you can find some stuff in the scroll for you as well. And obviously, subscribers, scroll is coming out Friday, Saturday, get you ready for the weekend, player pools, strategy, everything that you need for this week 6 slate. So that's going to do it for me. I will see you back here next week. I will see you on the site throughout the weekends, and I will see you at the top of the leaderboards on Sunday.